So the reason why I got pegged for this talk is because I'm from an apple farm. I'm from Minnesota. Our family, I have 10 brothers and sisters, and so when I got to be about 10, 12 years old, my parents says, what are we going to do to keep these kids out of trouble? Okay, let's go buy a farm. And then let's have it horticulture, so it's intensive labor. Okay, and part of it was let's plant 350 apple trees. Okay, that was the easy part actually. 3 acres of cucumbers wasn't fun in summer, but that's another story. Okay, so I've grown apples for 40 years. Okay, and also in North Dakota we started the first major community orchard in North Dakota out in Bismarck at United Tribes, where we have about 100 fruit trees out there and all kinds of really interesting, funky fruits that Kathy's going to talk all about, those kind of weird stuff that's show great potential for North Dakota. Why North Dakota? Because this is the toughest place to live. It takes a special person, it takes a special plant to tolerate North Dakota. So my goal here is to talk to you about how to get your backyard orchard started with apples. I got a handout for everybody. Let's say we're going to put in 10 plants here. What we want to do is we want to go out there with a clean bucket and a clean shovel, and I want to get a good representation of what's out here. So I'm just not going to take one shovelful right here because, you know, maybe some deer dropped its load here or something a couple years ago. It may not represent the area. So I'll take a small shovelful here, put it in my bucket, and then I'll take a lot of random other spots. Okay, when I lived in Wisconsin, they said you should do a W. There, here, there, there, there. And then when I was in Minnesota, they say do an M. There, there, there. I don't know about Dakota. We're kind of going in circles when I do a Dakota one. But you get the idea, okay? We want a composite sample. And then you mix it all up in the clean bucket. We're going about 6 inches deep. Mix it up. And then I'm going to ship it to Fargo, and then I'm going to find out what's in my soil. You know, now's a good time if we want to get going on this. Now in fall is a good time to take advantage of this opportunity. We don't have to just do all the gardening in spring. You know, we can take a soil sample now, and then if we have some nutritional issues, we can take care of them in the fall. Or the other thing about sometimes, like even Kathy said, some of the soil here isn't the greatest, and that's very common in areas that, like in rural areas, you'll put your best stuff in crops, and then the trees go in the less than desirable soil. Okay, so maybe it's like pasture even. Like when I started a community orchard in Bismarck, it was just an old abandoned pasture. So the fall gave me an opportunity to kill that old pasture and then to put in a nice turf like Kathy's got here. And a good weed killer for that is Roundup or glyphosate. Glyphosate in one trade name's Roundup, but there's lots of generics too. That's a good vegetation killer. It'll kill everything that's green and growing, and it has a short life. That's a great thing about glyphosate. And so everything's going to be dead in 2 weeks, and then I can work up the soil and put in my nice grass and get everything planned out for my garden. Then comes the question, how now we're going to get our trees. There's lots of good sources for trees, and I'll just show you a few of them here. We're in Carrington, we're in zone 4. That means it only gets to be about minus 25 in winter. Not so bad, right? But we're kind of getting close to zone 3, and that's like minus 30, minus 35. And so that's a lot of plants struggle in that. There's a nursery out of New York called St. Lawrence Nurseries that specializes in zone 3 plants, and they have a huge collection of heirloom apples. So especially if you like some old-fashioned apples, this is a good source. The other thing, it's a good idea to buy bare root. Bare root trees are much cheaper than a tree you get in a container. You can get a bare root tree for $20 to $30, but a containerized tree can cost twice that much. And you know, a lot of times those garden centers, they just buy the bare root tree, they stick it in a pot, put dirt in it, and then they bump up the price for you. So you don't need that. You know, you got to get your garden established ahead of time so that in spring you can slip these bare root trees right in. Then and there's all kinds of varieties, and Kathy here's got a good selection. This is a Harold Red. Harold Scent is the tradition. It's the apple of the Midwest, especially in the colder areas like in Minnesota. It's the cooking apple. Harold Red is a selection that's especially red. Kathy's got Honeycrisp over there. Honeycrisp. If you're going to plant one apple tree, I would highly recommend you plant Honeycrisp because it's just amazing fresh eating quality. Okay, and I can tell you from my own family orchard, we'll charge twice as much for a Honeycrisp as any other apple, and we'll also sell them out faster too. It's by far the best quality apple for a home gardener, Honeycrisp. And here's Sweet 16. Sweet 16, this was a good apple before Honeycrisp, I'd say. Now, it's kind of, I think it's been surpassed by Honeycrisp, but it's a good all-purpose, especially fresh eating apple. And Kathy's got some, here's a Hazen here, right here. Hazens are good because they're short trees. They're easier to manage. Fruit quality's not that great, but at least you'll get some fruit and you'll be able to manage it. Okay, so Kathy's got a good selection of trees, and if you ever want to go to Bismarck, I've got about 50 varieties on display out there. I'm happy to show you. Does anybody have any questions about selecting trees or getting the soil started? EML9, wow, you are sophisticated. You came here prepared. Okay, we're talking about, should we get a standard apple, a semi-dwarf, or a dwarf? Okay, that's a great question. And you know what? We don't have a great answer for you. That's the bad news, but we're working on that. I can say this. Here in Zone 4, and I would say well over 90% of the orchards in Zone 4 in the U.S. have a semi-dwarf or dwarf rootstock. Okay? Nobody grows standard rootstocks, but that's what I find in almost every garden center in North Dakota, right? It's just because it's just so brutal here. And the semi-dwarf and dwarfing rootstocks do not have the cold hardiness that a standard tree. So all these are standard trees. They're likely grafted on a Dolgo crabapple. And the reason why orchards don't mess around with standard trees is they're so slow to fruit. You know, it's not uncommon for a standard tree to take 6 years before you get a decent crop. 6 years. And after a few years, people they're getting anxious, you know. So what was this all about? Did I really get an apple tree or is this an ash tree? What's going on? I got nothing here. And then I hear people about, okay, you got to torture the tree. You got to show them who's boss. You got to threaten the tree, produce a fruit or die. And so then what we do is you get a baseball bat and you hit the trunk and you punish that sucker and say, fruit next year or the chainsaw. Or then people get nails and you scrape the bark, again, just to torture the tree, because the tree wants to have offspring before it dies. So the whole idea is if you think the tree's going to die, if you convince the tree it's going to die soon, it will produce a fruit. But that's not, torturing your trees is just sadistic. It's not for gardeners like us. We should love our trees. And if the tree's not ready to bear fruit, it's just not ready. Got to be patient. So then comes the option of should I get a dwarf tree? Because dwarf trees, they'll give you fruit in 3 years, guaranteed. Okay? The other drawback about these standard trees is these guys want to grow to 25 feet tall. It's hard to manage. It's hard to pick. Whenever it does fruit, it's going to be hard to pick those fruits. And of course, it's going to be impossible. Hard to spray, hard to prune, hard to manage in general. Whereas if you had a dwarf tree, and there is a dwarf rootstock from Siberia. It's called Bud 9. So the key question, there you go, you know about it. So the key question is, if it can survive Siberia, can it survive Carrington? That's the question. And so, but it's a very hardy rootstock. I've got 25 varieties of it in Bismarck. Haven't lost one yet from the winter hardiness. And the tree will only grow about 9 feet tall. That's it. And the other thing is that, especially in a home situation where you don't want to spend the whole yard on your orchard, you can have a tree every 9 feet. So you can really pack them in. We don't have good research on that yet, but I can just go from what other states. As far as you mentioned the East Malling types, East Malling 7 is by far the most common one grown in the Midwest. East Malling 7, that's a semi-dwarf. It's going to grow 12 up to 15 feet. So that's not a bad one either. Yeah, you can't go to the garden center. You can't go to Menards and buy a dwarf tree. So what you got to do is you got to get online. Hey man, what's the big deal? We're all online. Go to Google it in. Lawyer Nursery out of Montana, I hear. How about Maple Valley Nursery Yes, Maple Valley Nursery in Wisconsin has a great selection of Bud 9 rootstock. The problem is when you get to the dwarfing rootstocks like the Bud 9s, is you got to buy them in packs of 50, that type of thing, because it's for orchards, it's for serious growers, and so most people don't want 50 trees. So you got to find the perfect nursery that'll let you just buy one. Will Dogo interstock partially dwarf your tree? Well, if you use your imagination, it could. Okay, a Dogo tree wants to grow 20 feet tall, an apple tree wants to grow 25 feet tall. So there you go. That's not much dwarfing if you ask me, if they compromise. So, and the other thing is that a lot of times when you have a Dogo or a standard tree that's grafted, we worry that the graft is going to snap in the North Dakota wind. It'll snap. It's a weak point. Okay? So that's why if we're not into shrinking the tree, and that's like a Dogo or a standard tree, a lot of times we'll stick the tree so that the graft is a couple inches in the ground. Okay, so it's more secure. Ideally, it's not the best thing for the tree, but that's just the way it is. North Dakota's a hard place, and so you got to suffer a little bit. I'm going to stick you in a little bit deeper than what I'd like to. Now, if it's one of these dwarf trees, though, it has a dwarf rootstock and let's say a normal honeycrisp on top. If you plant that graft below the ground, that dwarfing effect will be lost. That honeycrisp that wants to grow 25 feet is going to take it over, and they'll send out its own roots. So in that case, you've got to keep the graft union above, a couple inches above. Generally, we hate planting trees too deep. It's wrong because the tree's biggest problem is usually after about 20, 25 years, you'll start noticing symptoms of girdling roots. The roots will encircle. But, hey, we're talking about apple production. I'm not talking about growing an apple for my great-grandkid, okay? I'm growing apples for me. This tree is going to lose its productivity after 30 years anyhow. If I'm an orchard, I'm planning on replacing trees after 30 years, okay? They just don't have the same vigor, You know the feeling after about 30, 40, 50 years? After 60, it's just not the same. Same with apple trees. They just don't quite have it after a while. They'll keep going, but just not the same. If they girdle themselves after 30 years, whatever, I'm going to pull out the plant anyhow. I just want it to survive for 30 years. Okay, then how about staking them? That's a great idea, staking them. And the best thing is use an electrical conduit pipe. Okay, just a conduit pipe, 3/4 inch conduit pipe. You get it they're 10 feet long. You buy them, go to wherever, the hardware store, on them 2 feet deep. And they'll provide good protection from the wind. And trees staked are more stable. They will bear earlier and they will bear more production. Now, if it's a standard sized tree, you can take the stake off after a few years. But if it's a dwarf tree, I'm never going to take that stake off. And even if it rusts, if it rusts at the surface, I'm just going to slide it over and then pound it 2 feet again in the ground. So it's stuck with that stake for life. But it loves that stake. They love each other. Okay, any other questions about picking your trees? So let's talk about pruning, how you prune a tree. For the timing. Obviously, you're an ambitious person, so you're out there in January. And the best time to prune is January to March. Best time is right before the growth starts in spring because the tree's still dormant. You can clearly see the branching structure. And also the wounds that you make won't be exposed to all that brutal winter. So if you can, wait till a nice day in March. By March, there's nothing going on. The Vikings aren't playing. There's nothing to do on a weekend. So go out there on a nice weekend and prune your apple tree. Let's talk about how you train the tree first of all. First of all, we want the tree to start at about 30 inches. Maybe lower than you think. Okay? Because that tree's only going to grow 12 feet tall. So let's get it started early. And then we want to develop a series of scaffold branches here like Kathy has. Okay, and another nice thing is you want strong branches. So the branches should be like 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. Okay, when they get near like this, they're going to crack open. And if they're horizontal like this, when we get a good crop after so many, Harrelsons are just loaded like grapes on an apple sometimes, and that tree won't be able to support those apples. So you want strong branches, 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and we'll get a series of scaffold branches about 2 feet here. We'll be focusing on getting a branch in each direction as best as Mother Nature cooperates. And then we'll have a gap here to allow for good air movement, and then we'll have another scaffold layer going on. Cut off the top of this tree because we got to show them who's boss. We're in charge, and we're not going to allow these guys to grow 25 feet tall. Like I say, I don't know how you manage it, and I don't know how you produce quality fruit. You know, people have a backyard apple tree. It's like a shade tree that blooms for 10 days in spring, and then it's just a hit and miss with the fruit. So they got worms or not, you know, whatever, quality or not, yield, whatever we get's good. But that's not good enough for us. We want to have high quality, productive trees. What do we do if it's a 40-year-old tree? Do we have to leave it? No, we don't. No, it's up to us. We're in charge. So what do we want to do? We can bring that tree down to size.